Good afternoon, ladies and gents. It is I, RP, and below me I have the Benda Napoleonbob 500. The namesake being that Benda wanted a small bike that punched above its own weight class. Now, if you know your history a bit like I do, the moniker, or rather the eponymous namesake of the Napoleonbob, Napoleon himself, is not exactly a very small or short man. In history, he is 168 centimeters, fairly normal for his time period. But nobody can deny that the French emperor himself is a very ambitious man. So without further ado, let's get into the meat of this motorcycle review with the Napoleonbob 500. Let's go. So, starting off with the performance section, the Napoleon 500 is outfitted with a 476cc liquid-cooled V-twin engine that puts out a peak power of 47 horsepower at 9,000 RPM and 42 Newton meters of torque at 7,200 RPM. You'll never need to see your RPM climb that high, however, in the real world, as most of that power comes in much earlier, around 5,000 RPM, and peters out very quickly from then on. And that power is solidly punchy despite the Napoleon's power-to-weight ratio, aided by relatively short gearing compared to its peers within this bracket like the Rebel 500 and Shotgun 650. The Napoleon 500 has strong low-speed acceleration to get around town, up slopes, and the pull feels awesome. However, because it excels on the low end, the high end suffers in that maintaining a 120 km/h highway speed is a struggle, and attempting overtakes in that speed bracket tends to feel like the engine is suffocating itself. On the bright side, what I liked most about the Napoleon 500 was the handling. Coming in at 215 kilograms wet, it is certainly not a light machine, and with how low it sits on the ground paired with the usual cruiser bobber wheelbase, it still retains the turning radius of an orbiting moon, stereotypical to this kind of bike. But when it comes to pushing it into corners and holding it there, then flipping it over to the other side, the Napoleon does it so effortlessly, it almost reminded me of its much smaller 125cc siblings. The factory Timson tires on the Napoleon 500 have solid traction in wet and dry and track really well in my personal opinion. The compound feels slightly soft, and I don't think it will maintain its decent profile for long. They also do not seem to be a mass production model either, and most likely made for stock machines. So there's a chance you won't be going back to these either if you liked it. For the Napoleon 16-inch rims, the alternatives that will fit its unusual profile will end up being pretty premium in pricing come time for a tire change, like Metzeler Cruise Tags. The braking was also pretty damn solid all around. The Napoleonbob 500 comes with a 16-liter fuel tank capacity, which is incredibly huge for what it is. And with me riding 80% expressways, I got an average fuel economy of about 25 kilometers to a liter. That means if you theoretically ride the bike down to the last drop, you would be getting around 400 kilometers of range to work with. Certainly in excess for what I would consider a city bike. Despite the Dark Flag 500 being jam-packed with a whole bunch of techie majigs, the Napoleon 500 leans much more the other way in favor of being simplistic. Now, simplistic is far too simplistic a term to describe the Napoleon 500, as Benda still puts modern tech into it. First off, the round 3-inch full-color LED dash does not surrender any more info to you, the rider, than a basic speedometer, tachometer, fuel gauge, clock, gear indicator, trip and odometer, as well as all the other basic indicator lights. The two touchscreen buttons at the bottom of the cluster do no more than let you switch between and reset the trip meter and to adjust the clock. The buttons, being what they are also frustratingly impossible to use with a gloved hand, and finicky at best with a naked thumb. The backlight itself is strong. However, the face material on the cluster itself is much too glossy, With the way it is angled, it suffers from slight readability issues under Singapore's harsh daylight sun. The Napoleonbob 500 also gets standard ABS that cannot be switched off despite what the manual says, as well as TCS that can be switched off but comes back on every time you start the bike. There really isn't much reason to turn it off to begin with. The bike is heavy enough and the tires both wide and grippy enough that the engine never overcame traction at any point short of attempting a drag launch, which I cannot do lest I lose all trust from dealerships island-wide. The drivetrain on the Napoleonbob 500 is also run through a belt, so no fussy maintenance or cleaning to deal with, and most importantly, no extra dirty crud to be flung up at you either. There is also a port on the front left side of the bike with a single USB-A and a single USB-C socket for you to plug in your devices if necessary. Tearing the Benda Napoleonbob 500 down to get a feel for user maintenance, the oil filter and drain plug looked fairly easy to get to, requiring at most removing a few bolts and belly pan for ample space to work with. The rear monoshock cover was also easy to get out of the way for adjustment. The battery, however, took a bit more effort than I felt necessary, requiring removal of the seat, part of the left panel, and then lastly a metal cover that kept the battery, fuse box and ECU all sealed inside a tiny compartment. As far as I am concerned, this was probably one of the better ways Benda could keep the electricals clear of any water and debris that would inevitably be kicked its way by the rear tire. But it also meant if you wanted to mount any electrical accessories, figuring a layout to patch them in and then find space for excess wiring in the coffin of a compartment is going to require a 3-year diploma in cable laying. Just like how Emperor Napoleon was of average height, I too come in at a very average 177 centimeters tall for my own time with an 85 centimeter inseam. The Napoleonbob 500 itself features a very aggressive riding posture at my height. You spend quite a lot of time leaning forward to reach the hand controls. While not as bad of a lean with its narrow, swept in and slightly downward facing handlebars, the strain on the lower back was real. The foot controls were also relatively comfortable, sporty but comfortable. I got a nice, slightly bigger than 90-degree bend at my knees that let me ride around loose without strain to my ankles or knees. The seat itself is pretty wide and ergonomic to comfortably hold the rider's bum, and surprisingly it felt soft and not uncomfortable to my sit bones at all on long rides. The front suspension itself is soft but not mush. It tackles bumps well without losing control, and the entire front end does a good job of isolating vibrations from reaching my hands. The rear, however, felt harsh and you can really feel almost everything going underneath your arse. The foot pegs had a thick rubber insert, but it somehow did very little to dampen the engine vibrations and made my feet numb. The brake levers were both responsive to actuation, as was the weight of the clutch lever, though I did feel like it would have been great to have at least adjustable levers to accommodate my small hands. The foot shifter though was a tad bit mush with way more free play than it needed to have. The mirrors, as was placed in the upward position, didn't really give that great of a field of view behind me, but in general it was serviceable. The kickstand itself also took a bit of getting used to, because when retracted it tucks neatly underneath the transmission case and you can't really see where it is with your eyes while seated. You find the ignition barrel on the left underneath the USB sockets, and the rudimentary steering lock can be found separately up front underneath the headstock. Also, while I know bobbing the rear fender short is the whole point of this style, and this might be a subjective experience, I think Benda leaned too much into the aesthetic and made it way too short for it to be practical. I personally would appreciate if Benda provided what other factory bobbers like Triumph's Bonneville bobber do by giving you a practical rear fender that stops crud and that you can personally decide whether to remove it later for the looks. Here, you are stuck with a half fender where Mr. Tire has a clear line of sight to your R's and you constantly get sand, dirt and pebbles flung on your back on a good day, and when it rains you might as well be drowning from the backsplash. Benda stays very true to the bobber aesthetic for the Napoleonbob 500. It is a gorgeous machine that succeeded at blending an age-old custom motorcycle style with modern sensibilities and poshness that might even rival many British and Italian design choices. The lines on the Napoleon 500 flow smoothly and seamlessly along its side profile with geometric beauty. From the instrument cluster to the seat, it is a beautiful uninterrupted downhill slope to the seat. Benda put curves all around the engine, the tank and the coverings where they possibly can to maintain conformity in its shape, and they carefully sized and placed the tank, radiator and exhaust pipes to highlight and not get in the way of admiring the exquisite engine on both sides. The black on the loaner bike I test rode also contrasted tastefully with the pale gold highlights added in modest amounts that give it a sense of luxury that hides its sticker price well. The feel of the tank and the frame are all a pleasure to the touch, with the frame featuring a fine textured surface. Even the panel lining, despite being merely vinyl decals that can easily be damaged over time, were well placed to break up the larger, monotonous spaces on the fork covers and tank. My only complaint would have been that the hand controls didn't really feel that premium. Most of the buttons themselves were absolutely solid, but the button that disabled the TCS was a tad bit mush, and the housing itself had very obvious seam lines that could have done with a bit of sanding. The only change I would do, and this is very specific to the Singaporean context, is to swap the mirrors from left to right and vice versa and point them downwards as an owner, as it is common for dealerships to hand off motorcycles with these kinds of mirrors pointed upward. Next would be repositioning the hideous OBU somewhere else, preferably on the right side beside the radiator. And lastly, not using a bar mounted phone mount. That keeps the front flat, sleek and neat. If you need a phone mount for GPS, a hollow stem nut and stem mounted phone mount made to fit the bike would do a lot to maintain the aesthetic. Benda has carefully worded the marketing materials surrounding the Napoleonbob 500, and I certainly admire that hallmark Asian virtue of not boasting more than you can deliver. They call it a contemporary urban motorcycle, specifying urban as in meant for commuting or city riding where one has to handle stop and go traffic. In this regard, they have succeeded in this application against the Napoleon's competition in the Rebel 500 and Shotgun 650, having better low-end power and superb handling. However, while good commuters tend to overlap quite frequently with utilitarian attributes, these do not necessarily go hand in hand. And as a utilitarian machine, the Napoleonbob does fall short and in the direction of a vanity piece by the standards of a factory bobber. Without a proper fender, the Napoleonbob remains a fair weather machine unless an owner decides to fabricate one on their own dime. What about its own namesake? As a bobber and a contemporary one at that, I personally cannot deny it checks every single box under those definitions. But As far as punching above its own weight, just like Napoleon did by defying an entire coalition with the resources of just one single nation, well, if we were discussing this in 2025, I would have said yes. But as of writing this in the second half of 2026, the Shotgun 650 has been reduced in price, and it, as well as the Honda Rebel 500, now hover at roughly the same exact machine price as the Napoleonbob 500 at around 15,000 Singaporean dollars. As such, the Napoleonbob 500 isn't so much an all-round magical unicorn as it wants to be, it just excels in its own niche. The Napoleonbob 500 is excellent as a secondary mode of transport, providing the vanity of a Triumph Bonneville bobber for less than half the price of the British brand. It is also a talking piece of art that drums up a conversation whenever you are at a petrol station. And most of all, it gives the most joy to the vainglorious who prefer to ride through dense crowded roads and cities, basking in the attention of 1,000 spectators. So that's all for my review of the Napoleonbob 500. If you enjoyed this review, do remember to give me a like, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. And I would appreciate if you could support me on my web store and get maybe a t-shirt, a hat, a mug, what have you, as every single cent counts and helps towards running this channel. Anyway, stick around for more videos. I will do as much as I can to bring more reviews from QJ, Benda, whatever I can get my hands on really. Stay safe out there, ride safe, and I'll see you next time. Peace out, bye bye.